So forgiveness is something which enables humanity to progress. And I think it's really, really very, very important virtue. And we must remind ourselves of it, because it can be eclipsed by retribution and recrimination, which generally speaking make matters worse.
Well, good evening again. That was the technical introduction. This is the live introduction, and it's lovely to see you all here. My name is Jamie Jauncey, and it's my enormous pleasure to introduce a man who's brought balm to the souls and smiles to the faces of millions of readers around the world for his series, his inimitable series, his novels, and his many other literary and musical and cultural endeavors of all kinds. Alexander McCall Smith.
Thank you, Jamie.
Sandy, last time we were together, it was 2 years ago in Charlotte Square, and it feels like a completely different era, doesn't it?
It does, yes. It's a different world.
It is a different world. Tell us, first of all, just what would you think of our new home here?
I think it's wonderful. I think this is going to work. I think a lot of people were worried about the Edinburgh International Book Festival leaving Charlotte Square because they were so used to that great atmosphere that Charlotte Square had. But I think this will be able to match that because it's a very, very nice space. And I think Charlotte Square was gorgeous. It was a wonderful setting, and we all loved it dearly. But it was getting a little bit crowded, and I think there's a bit more space here. And I'm sure that they will manage to make this every bit as much a delightful experience as Charlotte Square was.
Yes, I mean, what could be better for a book festival than a new chapter? And this is
yes,
a new chapter.
Yes, yes.
So we've all been through a very strange time since we last met, since over the last 18 months. How has it been for you? How did you survive the pandemic, the lockdown period?
Yes. Well, I think probably as everybody was the same. It was the same for everybody, really. We all had a real shock. Our lives were changed in a remarkable fashion, and for many people it was a very distressing and difficult period. I think, though, there were aspects of it which I suppose one might say are more positive, and in particular, I think it gave us a bit of a nudge to consider our lives and to consider how sustainable what we were doing was. And I think a lot of people really realized that we'd all been, or many of us had been, just far too busy. We were filling our lives with too many activities. At the beginning of this period, the first lockdown, I just happened to be reading 2 books about monasticism. It was a bit of a coincidence, but I was rereading Patrick Leigh Fermore's wonderful book on his visit to French monasteries in the 1950s, A Time to Keep Silence. And I was reading another book, a contemporary book, about the relevance of monasticism in the 21st century. And I found it really remarkable that these authors were talking about quiet and time for reflection. And that actually was quite important for me. So I went into this period ready, I think, to think a little bit more about how I was leading my life. And so many people to whom I've spoken have come up with a similar statement about what it meant for them. Now, obviously, there was a tremendous negative side to it as well, but I think that we can take something from this. And there were some other positive things. I think that I was quite struck by the way in which people in the street greeted one another. People greeted strangers in the earlier period. I think that faded a bit in subsequent lockdowns, but in the first lockdown, people actually in the street were smiling at one another and greeting one another. perhaps that was the effect of shared adversity, but it was remarkable. So I think we have learnt something about our world, and I hope that we take some of these lessons to heart.
Mm-hmm. You were also talking before we came on about now that we're in this sort of strange transition back to some kind of normality, being aware of a sense of disconnection.
Yes. Yes, that's something which I think is really very unfortunate, and it was a concomitant of what happened was that people's social networks are really badly affected by this, in that I think that we lost touch with friends, we lost a sense of the reality of our friends if we didn't see them. We felt that the world had somehow become rather different, and that included the world of our friends. And that, I think, was quite a distressing aspect of it. And I think we'll have to rebuild that. I think many people are going to have to try and rebuild their social networks, their friendships. Of course, it may remind us of the importance of friendship, and it may also remind us of the importance of looking after one another. I think that's something which came across really quite strongly, and we realized that there were these wonderful people who were providing these caring services in society, and we perhaps hadn't paid enough attention to the importance of what they were doing, and that was brought home.
Mm-hmm. It's been a very strange time, and now that we're kind of on the way back, are you managing to reconnect? Do you feel that you're...
Well, yes. I mean, you and I had a very good chat before we met here, and I was delighted to see you, that you still existed, Jamie.
Yes, indeed.
It was, really very reassuring. And then I've discovered with other friends, not of course with you, but I've discovered with other friends, they're saying the same things that they said 2 years ago. And people are cracking the same jokes, which that's really reassuring to hear one's friends haven't thought of anything new.
Your friends may not have done, but I think you have. And I know people, I know creative people who really struggled during lockdown, people who found it really difficult to maintain focus, to keep their routines going. Yeah. Not you, Scandi McCall Smith. I'm looking at your list of 2021 publications, and it makes me want to go and lie down in a darkened room. I mean, I don't know how you do it. You've got 5 novels coming out this year, the fruit of your monastic 12 months in lockdown.
Well, there you are. There you are. It was actually quite a good time from the writing point of view, because I wasn't able to do many of the things which previously had distracted me from
like travel, for example.
Like travel, yeah. I mean, my life was really very peculiar before this happened, in that I spent an awful lot of my time going to literary festivals all over the world and doing tours and all that sort of thing, which I enjoyed. But it did mean spending an awful lot of time in airports and an awful lot of time in hotels, that sort of thing. Now, obviously, there was a positive side to that, was meeting readers and seeing the world. But that obviously stopped. And that meant that I could spend more time at my desk, which I enjoyed doing. And so it meant that I was able to write a little bit more than I would otherwise have done.
So your creative source wasn't in any way impaired by I mean, were you not just affected by this sort of sense of unease that we've all had to live with?
Well, possibly, I think, possibly, but then, of course, when you're creating a fictional world, when you sit down to write fiction, you're going into a totally different world. And a number of people said to me, well, are you actually going to write about COVID and the restrictions around COVID and all these things that we've experienced? And I don't think I will, actually, because my novels, I suppose, I locate them in a world which has some connection with the real world, but which in some respects is detached from it. So, for example, in my novels, mobile phones don't exist. This is something which I've really stuck to. So I think I don't think I'll be writing about these recent developments.
Maybe they don't exist in your real world either. Do you have a mobile
No, I've got a mobile phone.
I mean, you look like someone who might not have a mobile phone. Am I?
I've not met anybody who doesn't have a mobile phone, but I believe that there are people who don't have mobile phones. Mobile phones actually spoil fiction. Fiction is spoilt by technology. So, for example, the detective novel is in danger of being ruined by technology or by Google. Because if you actually want to find out about anything, anybody or anything, the answer's there on Google. You just go and Google it. So this would be very bad news for somebody like Ian Rankin writing these detective novels, because Inspector Rebus would just go and Google somebody and say, oh, he obviously did it because the profile's right. So that changes things in the same way in which antibiotics are very bad news for opera, because in opera, people suffer very, very long misfortunes, la bohème. You know, Mimi dies for the whole opera, really. And in fact, what would happen now is somebody would say, Mimi, have this antibiotic. And she would make a miraculous recovery in Act 1, Scene 1. So really, these things are not particularly. So I never mention the internet in my novels, and I don't mention computers. Mma Ramotswe and Mma Ramotswe still have typewriters. Now nobody has a typewriter in the real world, but I think that sort of technology has got greater possibilities. And it's the same for, you know, when you think of what modern travel has done to fiction, it's wrecked stories of people on passenger boats. Somerset Maugham wrote these stories in which everybody took 2 months to get to the Far East. And of course, in that period, they could have affairs. So you would have affairs on the boat, and that was great for novelists. But you can't have an affair on an aeroplane. It's very difficult. It's discouraged. And so that's a very interesting issue you've raised there, Jamie. I think we could probably just talk about that and technology and fiction, but maybe we should go on to something else.
Well, we should also acknowledge that there are huge benefits to technology right here, because we are now able to have you, live audience, but we've also got people watching from all around the world this afternoon.
Really?
That is,
really? Oh, well.
That is a benefit of technology.
Yes. Well,
they do have computers, all of them.
They do, on computers.
On computers, I know, isn't it an extraordinary thing?
I thought we were going by airmail, but that's another.
There's a row of pigeons sitting on the roof with messages from Mma Ramotswe tied to their ankles. We'll talk about some of the new books in a moment, but a serious question, Sandy, first of all. I mean, you know, we're in the grip of a pandemic still, generally speaking. The world is on fire. Strong men are running repressive regimes. The Taliban have taken over Kabul. Yeah. And yet you seem to be able to summon an inexhaustible well of optimism and compassion. Where does it come from? Well, have you always felt like that about humanity?
Probably reasonably optimistic about humanity. I think that if one is entirely realistic about our human situation, one would probably end up weeping more or less permanently. I think that the world is a vale of tears, that there are immense challenges of the sort that you've just mentioned. But I think that just sitting and contemplating those endlessly actually doesn't help a great deal. I think one has to be realistic to a certain extent. One can't bury one's head in the sand. But really, you don't do anything to improve the situation if you dwell indefinitely on the world's problems. And so I think that one has to maintain a certain degree of optimism or a certain hope in one's attitude towards life, because otherwise you wouldn't achieve anything, you wouldn't bother. You see, if we contemplate something like some of these really serious problems such as climate change, which I suppose is the most dramatic problem facing humanity at the moment, if you if you just think about that and don't do anything, then obviously that continues at its galloping pace. But if you cultivate an attitude of cherishing the world and appreciating the world, then you want to do something about it. And so I think there's always a role for celebration of the world, for celebration of the things that would induce in one a desire to do something. So all of which suggests that actually really we do want to have a continued positive engagement, and that just saying that the world is a dreadful place is really no solution. It doesn't help. So that means that there's a role for music and the arts which are affirmative. And I think that's a really quite important point, because otherwise we might as well just pack up shop.
The other side of that, though, in your writing is tremendous sense of forgiveness for human foibles.
Yes, well, I think forgiveness is a terribly important virtue. I suppose I explore it in two series of novels, in the Mma Ramotswe novels, The Number One Ladies Detective Agency, and also in my Isabel Dalhousie novels, she being a moral philosopher who addresses these issues. And forgiveness is very, very important. And I think that we're often in danger of losing sight of the importance of forgiveness because we're encouraged to engage in recrimination and blame. We're looking for people to blame, we're looking for people to punish. And I think that means that we can dwell on the wrongs of the past. I'm not saying that you don't address the wrongs of the past, but you don't necessarily spend all your time focused on the wrongs of the past, that there comes a point at which forgiveness actually enables the future to start happening. So in personal relations, I think forgiveness is very important. You say to the person who's wronged you, right, you've wronged me, but we must move on. And so forgiveness is something which enables humanity to progress. And I think it's really, really very, very important virtue, and we must remind ourselves of it, because it can be eclipsed by retribution and recrimination, which generally speaking make matters worse.
And I mean, these are all themes that crop up in your new novel, The Pavilion in the Clouds. And you also mentioned the days when one sailed east, when one went out by steamship. That's also a feature of this book. So tell us a little bit about The Pavilion in the Clouds.
Well, the Pavilion in the Clouds is set in Sri Lanka when it was Ceylon. And that's a country which I rather like. It's a very physically beautiful country, and it's a really interesting country, and I've been there on a number of occasions and really took to it. And I thought that I might write something about it. I didn't envisage writing a full-scale novel, but then I sat down and wrote the story of people who were involved in the tea industry in the highlands of Ceylon, because we had visited, my wife and I had visited those places, and I noticed that there was a very strong Scottish connection with the tea estates and the tea industry there. And in fact, Scotland played a very major part in getting the tea industry in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, going. And I thought that was an interesting story. If you go up into the hills there, you see the names of these tea estates. You see this, I drove past a tea estate which was called Edinburgh, and then all these places, obviously, exiled Scots naming these places after familiar places of home. And so I thought it'd be rather interesting to write about some of these people in the 1930s, starting in the 1930s, because they led quite a lonely life, many of the tea people, and the children in particular were taken away from their families and sent back to school, and so they had a rather separate life after that. And it's the story of one particular family and one particular person who, when she's a child, does something which is pretty serious, we think. Of course, there's a great deal of ambiguity in the plot, but it's a story of life lived against big historical events, which is another theme which I find really interesting, that you get these major historical events, you get wars, movements, and all of these things happening, and against this background there are people leading ordinary day-to-day lives, and that I think is always quite a striking theme. So that's what lies behind it. And there's also, I suppose, one of the themes which the book deals with is how we make sense of the past, how we understand the past, and how we rectify it if we can. So all of that comes into it, and it takes us right up to the well, it takes us up certainly after the Second World War, and one of the things which I really liked about writing this was that I had the little girl, who's one of the central protagonists, have two dolls. She has these two dolls whom she names after two Chinese poets. I very much like Chinese poetry, obviously in translation. I can't read the original Chinese, but the translations that people like Arthur Waley did of the Tang poets and whatnot, they're beautiful little gems, these poems. And there were two poets, Li Po and Po Chui, that I rather liked. And she calls her dolls Li Po and Po Chui, and the dolls speak to her, as sometimes it's the case with children there. And the dolls see things, so we get the dolls' point of view on the world. And we see it from their view.
There are a lot of tensions in that book, aren't there? There's the colonial tension between the planters and the workers. There's the tension between the sexes amongst the Europeans. Then there's the tension of sending the child away or not to. It's a powerful story. It's told in your lovely, gentle, thoughtful way, but it packs a punch.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie. There's quite a lot going on in that. Quite a lot going on in that book, and I think at the end, one is meant not to be quite certain about what happened, which I think is a nice aspect of it.
Endings are difficult, aren't they?
Yes. Some endings you can leave up in the air. You can't not resolve things entirely, but you can leave a certain amount of ambiguity. Generally speaking, the reader wants to see justice done. This is something which Auden wrote about in his famous essay on the detective story. You actually want the wrongdoer to be punished, and generally speaking, writers sign up to that. And they sort things out. Although occasionally you have people like Patricia Highsmith, who lets Ripley get away with it. You know, Ripley doesn't ever get caught. And if ever there were a case for a posthumous novelist to finish off a series, it's somebody to sort out Ripley. But I don't know whether the Patricia Highsmith estate would think that's a good idea. They may not.
Well, let's move on to the series now. And so this year, we've got Precious Ramotswe's husband, Mr. J.L.B. Matakoni, entering the transport business.
Yes.
We've got Professor Igelfeld digging his heels in and seeking his inner hedgehog.
Yes.
And we've got Detective Varg swimming in the murky waters of the art world, haven't we? And everybody has their favourites. Mine, I have to say, is Bertie and Scotland Street. So tell us, what's going on in Scotland Street?
Well, I'm writing volume 15 of the Scotland Street series. It's appearing chapter by chapter as I write it in the Scotsman newspaper.
Has it started?
It started, yes. We're on chapter 7, I think, today in the Scotsman. And then, of course, it comes out as a book. So I have to keep ahead of the newspaper. This is a genuine serial novel.
It's the longest in the world.
It's the longest-running serial novel in the world, I think. But it's the Royal McCoy, in that I am actually writing it as it's been. I haven't finished this book, but it's appearing in the newspaper, so I have to.
And it's going to be published in November.
And it'll be published in November.
You better get cracking.
Well, yes. What am I doing, sitting here talking to you when I could be writing Scotland Street? So I'm having great fun with it. Because we've got the usual characters. I love visiting my favourite characters in Scotland Street, of whom Bertie is one. Poor little Bertie. I mean,
Still 7?
He's still 7. I've got no intention of changing Bertie's age. We're just ignoring chronology in that respect. Everybody else is having birthdays, but poor Bertie, he's still 7. I was hoping that I could read a little excerpt.
I would love you to read it.
Could I do that now? This is as yet unpublished. This is chapter 35, so I'm a little bit ahead of the newspaper. And this is Bertie's farewell to, the chapter's called Bertie's Farewell to Ranald Braveheart McPherson. Bertie's got a good friend called Ranald Braveheart McPherson. Generally he's at school with thoroughly poisonous types. There's Olive and Pansy, who are his tormentors. Dreadful, dreadful little girls. And then there's Larch, who's a thug, and so on. And so Bertie's going off. He's being sent off to Aberdeen. His mother, who's a dreadful woman, has gone off to Aberdeen to do a PhD and has left the family. But she's now insisting that Bertie should come up for 3 months in Aberdeen. And Bertie's really very upset about this. He really doesn't want to go to Aberdeen. And he's perfectly happy in Edinburgh. And he's heard that Aberdeen is very cold, and he just doesn't want to go there. So he's about to go off to Aberdeen, and his grandmother, Nicola, who's looking after him and his brother Ulysses now, takes them off for a final day in Edinburgh before he goes off. And so this is this little excerpt where Bertie goes off with Nicola to spend this final day in Edinburgh before his exile, 3-month exile in Aberdeen begins. Ranald Braveheart McPherson had never stepped inside Valvona and Crolla before, and was wide-eyed with wonder as they crossed the threshold of the famous Edinburgh delicatessen. "Can you eat all of these things?" Ranald asked, his gaze moving from the shelves stacked with pastas, via the stacked wedges and circles of cheese and the bowls of bright peppers, to the hams and salamis hanging up behind the counter. Bertie, who had regularly accompanied his mother on forays to the shop, was on familiar ground. "You can eat all of these things, Ranald, and they're very tasty, I can tell you." Nicola pointed to the boxes of Panforte de Siena on a low shelf behind them. "That's Bertie's absolute favorite over there," she said. "Panforte de Siena. It's a sort of flat cake." "Full of fruit, Ranald," said Bertie. "Orange peel and raisins and things like that. You'd like it, I think." Ranald Braveheart McPherson had started to salivate. A small trail of saliva ran down from his lower lip, dribbled over his chin, and fell in a tiny drop on the front of his shirt. Noticing this, Nicola extracted a handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at Ranald's chin. Bertie looked at his friend with sympathy. "I know how you feel, Ranald. I know that you don't get much nice food at home." "Bertie," exclaimed Nicola reproachfully, "I'm sure that's not true." "But it is, Mrs. Pollock," said Ranald. "My mother's not a very good cook. She drinks, you see. She drinks wine when she's meant to be cooking, and she gets the ingredients wrong. She doesn't mean to, but she does." "That's rotten luck, Ranald," said Bertie, "having a drunkard for a mother." "I know," said Ranald. "We're both jolly unlucky, aren't we? My mummy's a drunkard, and yours is a well-known hate figure. We'd both had bad luck, I think." Nicola glanced around them. "Now, boys, you mustn't talk like that. Ranald, I'm sure your mother only has the occasional glass of wine. There's nothing wrong with that." "Oh, no," said Ranald. "She drinks far more than that, Mrs. Pollock." "And Ranald's father was had up in court," said Bertie. "Tell my granny about that, Ranald." Before Nicola could stop him, Ranald started to explain about his father's prosecution for a technical company law offence and the resultant community payback order that had been imposed on him at Edinburgh Sheriff Court. "He has to do over 100 hours of Scottish country dancing," Ranald said. "He hates it." He shouldn't have been a crook then, Ranald," said Bertie helpfully. "No," said Ranald, "you're right, Bertie." Bertie remembered something else. "And now my father's planning to overthrow the British government, isn't he, Ranald?" "Your father, rather." Ranald Braveheart McPherson nodded. "My daddy wants Scotland to rise up," he explained to Nicola. "He thinks the rising might start in Morningside and then spread to Fairmile Head. He says there are lots of people in the area who are ready to rise up." Goodness me, said Nicola. He and some friends tried to raise a standard in Morningside Road. Ranald continued, but the traffic wardens came and moved them on. Nicola suppressed a smile. I see, she said. He says the French will come to Scotland's aid, Ranald continued. He said they will definitely send ships. That's interesting, said Nicola. I'm not sure if Scotland can count on the French. That was one of the problems that Bonnie Prince Charlie had, I think. Ranald remained confident. The English will run away when the French come, he said. My dad says he's heard this from the man who cuts his hair. He knows all these things. I've heard him. He cuts my hair too. He's one of the people who will rise up, my dad says. And so on. I'll just get to the end there. After their visit to Balvona and Crolla, Nicola took them as promised to the Chambers Street Museum, where they spent an hour or so in the machinery department, marvelling at the old vehicles and the antiquated rockets. They saw an old instrument for the administration of chloroform and a Van de Graaff generator. They saw a model of the workings of coal mine with a tiny cage in which minute painted dolls, their faces darkened with coal dust, were poised to descend into the depths. Nicola gazed at this while the boys moved on to another exhibit. She thought there were so many stunted lives. She saw a picture of a Highland black house, a windowless button ben, outside which the members of her family were standing, and she thought of the Clarences and all the sorrow of life in Scotland. And then she thought, perhaps that is what one should think in a museum, and one should not be surprised to feel that way. Then they caught a bus that took them to Morningside, where Ranald Braveheart Macpherson lived. On the doorstep of Ranald's house, Bertie said goodbye to his friend. Nicola, sensing the importance of the moment, stepped to the side, pretending to admire a fuchsia in the Macpherson garden, while Bertie spoke to Ranald. I hope that you come back, Bertie, said Ranald, grasping Bertie's hand in a handshake. I'm sure I shall, Ranald, said Bertie, not with any real conviction. There was a silence. Then Bertie turned and began to walk down the path. He stopped. He turned and looked back at Ranald Braveheart Macpherson, standing there on his doorstep with his spindly legs. Bertie looked up at the sky. It was blue and empty. He raised a hand to wave, and Ranald Braveheart Macpherson, his friend, his only true friend, did the same. Nicola watched. She struggled with the tears that were just below the surface, a struggle that most of us have when one comes to think of it, most of the time. Poor Bertie.
Bertie addresses the constitutional question. Now, when our live audience were coming in, we were treated to some lovely music from a young man called Robbie Gregg, who was a student of traditional music at the college in Uist, and he is now going to come and give us another tune. So settle back and enjoy, everybody. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Robbie. 100 hours of country dancing to that one.
There would be no sentence at all. No.
Music to stir the soul. Talking of stirring the soul, poetry, Sandy, this is a new departure for you, or relatively new, I think. You've been writing a lot of poems, and last year you brought out this lovely book, In a Time of Distance. And I believe that the title poem you read on Radio 4, was it on Today? Or was
yes, I wrote the title poem in a Time of Distance for Radio 4 for the Today programme. And it seemed to interest a number of people, and so it's included in this collection and is there. And the Time of Distance talks about conditions that we were in then and how we were distant from one another because of events. And it was, I suppose it was a reflection on how we found certain inner resources during that time of distance. And I think a number of people identified with that sentiment. So it reached quite a large number of people, and I was pleased about that.
So this collection, I mean, had you been writing for a while, or did you write them all during?
No, this actually is a collected poems from quite a few years, because I had written. I had published quite a number of these in various places. In the Scotland Street books, every book in that series contains a poem which I put into the mouth of Angus Lordy, one of the characters. But I'd also been writing a lot of poems for composers who were setting them to music. So I collaborated for many years with an Edinburgh composer, Tom Cunningham, and Tom and I have done a lot together, and so I was writing a lot for him to set music. And many other composers, actually, I've been working with over the years. And so really it was a question of putting these poems all into one, under one set of covers. And I must say I really enjoyed that process. They're poems that I've written in response to various places that I've been. There are various themes. There's a series of poems there about the 7 hills of Edinburgh, which I wrote for the St Mary's Music School, and they have they're commissioning 7 composers to write pieces of music about the 7 hills of Edinburgh, and have a series of concerts culminating in a major concert in 2023. So that's
these are the pupils at the school?
These
former pupils?
They're people who have some association with St Mary's School.
Right.
So they're largely young composers. Most of them established as composers, and some very interesting work, I think, is being done there. So they're not setting my poems to music, so these are not to be sung, but they are written, the poems are meant to inspire a particular piece. So they're reading the poem and then writing their response to it, rather than setting it for a singer.
Yes. Can anybody name the 7 hills of Edinburgh? I can't. Hands up?
Oh, Jamie, I'm sure.
Come on, would you tell us?
No, don't ask me.
This sounds like Rome.
But we have got 7 hills. We've definitely got 7 hills, and I've been up most of them, all of them actually, and I suspect you have as well. They're much easier than Munro's. I've only climbed 1 Munro in my life.
I've climbed 2.
Have you climbed 2? Well,
so.
don't boast, Jamie, but
no,
not
sorry. I mustn't overshadow you. Would you like to read us a poem?
I'll read one poem quick. They're short, I hasten to point out, very, very short. This actually isn't in the collection, but this is one which I wrote a couple of months ago. It's called The Idea of Metaphor in EH3, the postal district of the New Town. The idea of metaphor in EH3. One thing may always be another. That which we think is apparent may conceal a nature at odds with its exterior. Every child understands that a shape in the darkness is often more dangerous than anodyne parents would admit. A chair, a cupboard, even a cushion, these are all potentially wild animals, ill-intentioned burglars, lurking each, awaiting their moment. Only the switching on of a light may reduce such intruders to their proper position in the inventory of the bedroom. But even in daylight, or on the rational and printed page, set out in unambiguous terms, that which we think we recognize may be something else altogether. Thus, a cloud no bigger than a man's hand may be a double metaphor, both for smallness and for threat, combined for far greater effect. A handshake may be a perfect mode of transmitting infection or a sign of fellowship and shared humanity. Infection is human too, and so the handshake becomes a semiotic recipe for everything we love and fear. A game of tennis is about accuracy of eye and forearm strength, but also about competition and rivalry, and most of all, about sex. Every player knows that well, hardly needs to point to the work love does in Wimbledon's scoring system. Wimbledon itself is being a metaphor for an entire game, a whole afternoon, and strawberries, rich and red, like flesh, inviting of love bites. A bird may be a bird, or a metaphor for freedom. Icarus is a young man, or a warning, or even an engineering issue. Above the grave of Orpheus, nightingales, we're told, still sing, metaphors each for what we feel, for what we know we've lost.
As always, so much there to make us think. I think it's time to take some questions, and I've got some coming in on the superhighway here on the iPad. So I'm going to ask you a question from our online audience, and I'd encourage you people out there to keep the questions coming. But we also have a roving mic, so we'll take some questions from people here in our live audience as well. But let's start with a question from Kate, who says, if you could save only one of your characters from a disaster, who would you save?
Oh, dear me, that's really such a difficult question. It really is. It's like asking a parent, which child do you prefer? And so you would have to say, you'd save them all, which doesn't answer the question. I suppose I probably would have to save Bertie, because he's only 7. And, you know, he's been around for 20 years, but he's only 7, and therefore we'd have to give him more of a chance.
Okay. I think you passed the test there. Could we have a question from someone in the audience? Has anybody got a question? Anybody feel like lowering their mask and asking us a question? Okay, well, I'll give you a minute to think, because we've got some more coming in from the online audience. So this is Addie, who says, as an Edinburgh Newtown girl, now exiled to Hertfordshire, 44 Scotland Street kept me going through the lockdowns when I couldn't return to EH3. Your observations of the inhabitants of the new town are so accurate. Are your characters all based on real people you have met? And I have a complaint with you, Sandy.
Oh, yes, what's it?
I'm not in one of your books
yet.
Jamie,
you will be. I shall go home and put you in, and you'll come out of it really well.
Will I?
You know, I'll give you a really good role, even a speaking part.
But anyway, to the question.
Yeah.
To the question.
Well, I obviously don't write real people in without their permission. So you won't find that for most of my characters, you won't find that there's a model somewhere in the background somewhere. Because I think that's a bit unfair. It's potentially embarrassing. They can't answer back and so on. So I think you have to be very careful about that. I do put real people in, but they travel in the books under their own name with their permission. So I put real people into these books, particularly the Scotland Street books and the Isabel Dalhousie books. And even the Mma Ramotswe books, I put a couple of real people in Botswana in, as I say, with their agreement. But I don't base the characters. I don't think of people I've known and then create a fictional character which would be like them. Now, obviously, I draw on the experience of knowing people. As you go through life, you meet all sorts of people, and you see all sorts of human characteristics, and you use that. As a writer, you use that when you're describing your characters, but that's a little bit different.
I remember doing an event in Charlotte Square a few years ago, and you introduced our mutual friend Charlie MacLean, who appears as the Duke of Johannesburg.
Yes, he does, yes.
And you introduced him on stage as the Duke of Johannesburg.
Yes, yes.
And afterwards, as we were going out, I heard somebody say, that was the real Duke of Johannesburg.
The Duke of Johannesburg. Yes, and in fact, Ian McIntosh, my illustrator, did a wonderful pen sketch of Charlie as the Duke of Johannesburg, and we put those into the books. So he still has a role in those books. He appears in them every year. Guy Peplow is another friend that I put in from time to time. Guy crosses the stage and says something to Isabel Dalhousie and whatnot. So Jamie, don't worry, you will be in it. You will be in it. And
that's marvellous.
You'll like the result.
Could we have a question from the audience? Please put your hand up if you'd like to. So there's one over there, and then we'll take another one from the online, and then we'll go to the gentleman at the very back.
When writing a novel, what does a typical day look like? Is it 500 words by breakfast?
Right, well, thank you for that. What I tend to do, and it differs a bit. I mean, I don't follow an entirely consistent pattern, but I often get up in the small hours. So I would get up at 3 in the morning, or 2:30 in the morning, and I might write for an hour or so, maybe a couple of hours, and then I go back to bed, go back to sleep. And then I would write, mostly in the morning. I tend not to write in the afternoon. I don't do that very much. I would write, when I'm writing a novel, as I'm writing at the moment, I'm writing Scotland Street and the next Isabel Dalhousie. I would like to get, these days, about 2,000 words written a day, and on a good day, 4,000 words. So it's quite a lot. But it's no great effort. I sit there and I go into what the psychiatrists would probably describe as a minor dissociative state, in which I'm aware of my surroundings, but I'm communicating with a part of the mind, because a lot of fiction comes from the subconscious mind. And so I don't have to say to myself, what's going to happen now? It just comes. And I really, it's very peculiar, but that's the way it works. And I don't really have to edit it very much. It just comes onto the page. I don't exactly hear a voice, but it follows a certain sort of rhythm. I hear a beat in my mind, and the words fit in with that. That's how it works. But you actually have to be disciplined about it. You can't wait for the muse to come and tap you on the shoulder, because she won't. So don't wait for inspiration. I'm sure that there will be people here today or watching remotely who write. And my advice to people is, don't wait for the muse. She's not going to turn up. You have to go to the desk, and you have to work at it, and that's the way it works for me.
I'm wondering, Sandy, whether being in a minor dissociative state is a prerequisite for membership of the Truly Terrible Orchestra. We have a question here from Dorothy.
Yes.
Have you been practicing during lockdown for the Truly Terrible Orchestra, and does your wife mind?
I haven't. I'm really in default. I'm one of the defaulters in the Really Terrible Orchestra, in that I haven't been to rehearsal for ages. During the lockdown, they were rehearsing remotely through Zoom. And
that must have been...
well, it was great because nobody could hear what the others were playing, you see. And when you come to the Really Terrible Orchestra, that's a great positive point. You don't really want to hear. Unfortunately, the RTO always does a fringe concert, but this year it was decided not to do it because the orchestra hadn't really been able to practice in the flesh, and the results would have been so distressing to to St. Cecilia and others that they decided not to do it.
We had a question up at the back from a gentleman there.
Hello, I wondered about the process of writing, whether you laugh out loud whilst you're writing.
Thank you. Yes, I do, I must confess. I occasionally, I certainly smile, and then occasionally I burst out laughing when things get out of control. So with my new book in the von Igelfeld series, the Your Inner Hedgehog, I really had great difficulty keeping a straight face throughout the book because it's so absurd, and it's great. I tend to laugh when I write Scotland Street. I mean, when I write about Bertie and Olive and Pansy, their conversations, I really sometimes have to stop because I'm seized by laughter.
You certainly laugh when you're reading it.
Well, yeah, no, one shouldn't, but there we are.
No, I think one should. I would take one more question from the online audience. Ignoring that no one here uses a mobile phone, he's referring to your fictional world. What has not changed in real life, EH3, in the last 2 decades that you're grateful for?
What has not changed?
What has not changed, yes.
Oh, my goodness. That's a very interesting question. Well, what has not changed in the Edinburgh New Town or Edinburgh generally? I think people, what hasn't changed that I'm very grateful for is the relative intimacy of Edinburgh. Edinburgh's quite an intimate city. It's villagey. I mean, people often say that of large cities, that they have their individual villages and that. But I think that sense of citizenship in Edinburgh hasn't changed. And if you look at Muriel Sparks' wonderful Prime Minister Jean Brodie, there's a point at which Jean Brodie says, "You young gals, we are citizens of Edinburgh," and she's talking about that sense of what you would in modern terms describe as community, and that's survived the modern world. The modern world has become so anonymous, so vast and anonymous, and Edinburgh has retained that sense of community and manageability. That's probably what I would draw attention to.
Yes, and that is particularly in these times such an important community. Community has never been more important.
Yeah.
We could take one last very short question from our live audience, if there is one. Well, I think this lady had her hand up first, second row from the front. If you could be brief, madam, we would appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm sure many, many years ago, I heard that there were just going to be 10 Mma Ramotswe books. I don't know how many there are now, and the same with the other series. Have you got any limit to what you're doing?
Well, thank you very much for that question. That question comes from Sue Tritton, who was our local councillor for many years and a really good local councillor. Sue, I voted for you many, many times. And she's very modest. I'm embarrassing her, but she did a lot of great. And I'll give you the latest Mma Ramotswe. Come round to the house, and I'll give you all the latest books. I'm going to carry on, Sue. I intend to carry on writing these books until somebody stops me. So I don't know whether that answers your question. I'll tell you actually. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, a couple of years ago, and I did an event, and this woman came up to me afterwards, and she was very friendly. She intended to make a complimentary remark and said to me, "You know, you're going to be far more successful posthumously."
Well, thank goodness she was wrong. Thank goodness she was wrong.
So there will be more books. There are lots more planned, and they'll all be written, I hope, until I stop.
So on that note, we're going to have to bring things to a close. But Sandy, I think you'd like to end by reading us a final poem.
A final poem.
Talking of the past,
just to bring,
as we have done.
Yeah, which refers to the past. It's brief, and it is called So Yesterday. You know, in the way in which we insult people by saying, you're very yesterday. Well, I would. I mean, I don't know anybody else would insult, but I'd certainly say, so yesterday. So this is called So Yesterday, and it's about the merits of being so yesterday. Among the reproaches by which we signal disapproval of those we know, some are clearly capable of only one interpretation. To say to others, you look awful, suggests that they do. Awfulness is hard to view in a positive light, which is an awful state of affairs, but stubbornly the case. But then there is, you look so last year, or worse still, you are, and in the space you insert a decade, usually a long time ago, as in, you are so 1960s, which can be met by an injured and reproachful silence, but need not be, not if you think for a moment about the merits of the decades we've put behind us. I am, I admit, so last year myself. I like clothes that don't fit too tightly, allow for expansion. I like soap that smells of soap and not of Carolyn pepper or obscure botanicals, that comes in boxes labeled simply soap. I like milk from which nothing has been extracted, that can be used to make all sorts of illegal cheeses. I like telephones connected to the world by a wire. I like strangers who say good morning, even though they have no idea whether you deserve a greeting. I like men who take the risk of letting women walk through doors ahead of them rather than racing to go through first. I like children who speak politely. I like everyone who talks in sentences that somewhere contain a verb. I like films in which few people die and hardly any of the actors swear at one another or at the world. I like dogs of recognizable breed or simple mongrels, not those bearing names bolted together, labradoodles and so on. I like honest dogs who don't question why the ball or stick must be fetched and who sit when commanded, sometimes for hours. I like all these unfashionable things, although I know you will say you are so irredeemably yesterday. I like yesterday, in fact. I liked it then, and I still do. When I think of tomorrow, I think of yesterday and how it glowed.
Well, that brings us to a close, and I'd like to thank all of you, our live audience, for being here tonight. It's quite marvelous to sit here on stage in front of real people, isn't it, Sandy?
To be here again, yes.
And I'd also like to thank our online audience, who I know are around the world. You have followers on every continent. And I'm sure that some of them have been tuning in this evening. And that, of course, is an unexpected benefit of what's been going on over the last 18 months, is that we've all become much more used to attending online events, and we can attend them from wherever we happen to be. So that's a great boon. But most of all, I'd like to thank you, Sandy, for entertaining us, as you always do so wonderfully, for the last hour.
Thank you, Jamie.